What's going on, everybody? Super Tuesday. Welcome, 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 welcome. We got a live and in-studio audience with us tonight. Crazy things happening at Mirai. Ira and I built the redwood greenhouse over the past 2 days because, as we suspected and feared, we went from almost 90 degrees to now, hello, it's going to be freezing very, very soon. Winter preparation is in full swing. And generally we started at this time of year. We just haven't had the transition. Believe it or not, the first deciduous tree to lose its leaves in the entire garden at Mirai. Thank goodness you chose this one. We got Ira on the mic this evening.
What's up?
Josh Sales producing the stream from the mothership. Jesus and Lonnie in the house. We got David, Shelley, and Rafi in studio. Hello, hello. We have any announcements?
We do have a couple. The long-awaited Apical Ag Solutions podcast with David Naus is coming out tomorrow, and all the feature content that we've been talking about in advance of the Pacific Bonsai Expo about packing trees in cars and trucks, that's coming out shortly as well.
Wow, wow. Yeah, definitely. Prior to my time in Japan, nobody ever taught me how to pack a tree in anything, you know? I kind of launched them into the back of the truck and hoped everything went well on the journey. And I think a lot of us have experienced the trauma of getting somewhere in this tree we've spent so much time on because we thought it'll probably be okay. Was not okay, right? Check it out. It's really good content. But the David Naus Apical Ag podcast is, I'm excited. I'm excited for it to launch. I'm excited to listen to it again because I gleaned so much from his knowledge and information. Rafi and I have been having an intense debate about the skepticism around the information, and 18 months at Mirai, I can tell you it's on point from what we've seen and experienced through the use of this nutritional information. But take a listen. I'm sure it will create more questions than give you answers, and that has been the frustrating part of trying to wrap our mind around a subject matter that is so complex when you think about the way that a plant functions, and the fact that science is so far behind that we really don't understand nearly as much as we need to be making the adjustments and adaptations to the cultivated, practice of agronomy in terms of vegetables, fruit, bonsai trees. And we actually get to talk with a vascular researcher this week. Anthony Ambrose is going to join us on the podcast. So we have some serious information lined up for you guys. Anything else?
Now let's rock and roll.
We're ready to go. We got PBE coming. Is that next weekend?
Not this weekend, next weekend. Cover wagon coming in hot.
Pacific Bonsai Expo covered wagon heading to California. If you need anything on the covered wagon, you need to let us know now or forever hold your peace. We'll be there. We won't be in force, but we will be there in spirit. And I'm actually making our stands for the display right now. It's taking up a lot of time, and I'm proud to be doing it. Anyways, let's rock out. Okay, you had the choice between pomegranate, quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides, and Korean hornbeam. The pomegranate and the Korean hornbeam, neck and neck. The Korean hornbeam just necked it out. Now, I'm excited to talk about this Korean hornbeam specifically because this is a true OG from the source Korean hornbeam. This is not a field-grown tree. This is not a tree that was cultivated outside of South Korea. This is a collected hornbeam from South Korea, most likely went to Japan, almost inevitably went to Japan, and then was imported into the United States long ago when importation was still legal. And you can tell because when we start to look at Korean hornbeams and we see cultivated Korean hornbeams that have been built in the field in North America for the most part, right? Now, Talperian Farms produce some of the best field-grown Korean hornbeams that I've ever seen. It takes 80 to 100 years to get this kind of barking characteristics, muscling and trunk dynamic in a Korean hornbeam. They will form bark earlier than that time, but to get this kind of age into the trunk, and go ahead and focus on this for a minute, Josh Sales. Let's take a look at this. You get this muscling, you get this cracking, you have this gradation of the color in the bark. This is Korean hornbeam coming out of the mountains, right? And if you start to think about, are there more? Do these still exist? No. Not near to the degree or to the spectacular age that the Korean hornbeam collecting boom sort of accessed in that moment in time. You can't find them in Japan, you can't find them anywhere else unless they were imported long ago and have passed through the hands of a collector. Now, some of us have the opportunity to acquire these, to work with these, and that's where breaking down the knowledge is so very important, okay? So there is a fundamental thing that is happening with this tree that is very, I think, representative of broadleaf deciduous trees in general, and that is this tree was styled in the traditional form, okay, and we see that because all of the lowest branches are hanging down like a pine tree, right? Now, as those pieces kind of move up the structure, they go from down to kind of lateral to kind of up all the way to the top, and that's where we get this fundamental symmetrical ball-like form. Now, with broadleaf deciduous, we say, hey, we don't want defined pads, okay? We want billowy masses, but we want billowy masses that are carrying forward the iconic and identifiable growth habit of the broadleaf deciduous form. And some of, when we talk about Stewartia has the very acute angles, Populus tremuloides, very acute angles. We start to talk about the maples, we get a little bit more of that expansive oak-like form. When we look at Korean hornbeam, and we look at any broadleaf deciduous, when you carry the branches down, and you keep those branches down, we see those branches atrophy. We see them lose strength. We see them, over the course of time, shed their interior twigs, develop a much weaker bud on the tip, and eventually perish. And that's a real problematic thing. Because when we look at this, again, the number of locations where structure emerges in a tree is what determines the value of that tree for the most part when we're talking about a deciduous tree, a really well-structured pine, etc. Right? Juniper is a little bit of the exception, but even then, more structure equals more value for the most part. So when we look at this bottom lowest branch here, most of the branches are occurring. We've got here, these are kind of inter elbow, right, in between that actual protrusion there, but nevertheless in a good location to be dropped off in the design, a good location to be dropped off in the design just below this major cut, good location to be dropped off in the design just above this major cut. We've got great structure as far as there's no ridiculous flaws, etc. But the strength discrepancy and the fact that the lowest branch, which gives us the highest degree of value in the structure, being such a low occurring branch, losing strength, losing interior ramifications, suffering continual dieback. And I mean, I've got dead stubs. I have dead stubs across the entirety of this branch. Everywhere I look, I've got dead stubs showing the atrophy and the weakening of this branch over the course of time. I have got to adjust the design. I've got to adjust the design if this tree is going to regain the even distribution of strength. Now, this is the time. Fall leaf drop, we see the color change. Trees, the leaves start to dry up and naturally fall off. They dry up and we're able to remove them. This is the very best time. Right now, all of those resources being moved through the tree. If we've got weaker areas of the tree, we've got stronger areas of the tree, now's the time. Prune it, allow that distribution, allow that hormonal setup to take place, and next spring we're going to see a dramatic response to this strength balancing that we're doing in this action tonight, that leaf drop pruning, okay? So, I'm going to go through, I'm just going to quickly kind of clean up both leaves as well as stubs on the branches. Now, one thing I want to show you, Jesus, go ahead and bring the camera in closer. I'm just going to put my tool here, but I'm not going to cut until you're in. Great. Okay. Now, one of the things that we have to understand when we're taking off dead stubs or we're pruning off branches that we don't want, a lot of us try to prune diagonal to that branch so that we minimize the amount of wood that is existing, and we try to minimize that scar. The more diagonal that you prune to that branch, the more of the stabilizing tissue that actually connects to your secondary ramification or tertiary ramification we take away. We compromise the structure of that junction. When you're taking away dead branches, you can just barely see here a nice little sort of defined line right there. Nice little defined line. Let me move that. You see that line right there? That really beautiful defined line. That's actually the color of the branch. I want to respect that. I want to cut perpendicular to the branch. This is entering straight here. I'm going to cut straight perpendicular across it. Now what that does is it leaves a little bit more tissue here that we've got to be careful of. Maybe we need to come back and shave this with a razor blade as it starts to heal if it bulges at all. But it keeps that junction where that branch transitions, keeps that junction intact and all of that wood secure so that we can come back and wire, bend, and handle this, and I don't have to worry about that location splitting on the tree. Okay, very important part of broadleaf work where I know as a beginning bonsai practitioner, I used to read in the books that you've got to get it right up tight or else it's going to swell or else it's going to deform the branch or else it's going to leave a stub. I'm not telling you to leave a stub, but I'm saying, listen, if I've got a branch here, I've got a branch here, I really want to be cutting that piece perpendicular to the line of that branch. Boom, I'm going here. I got to cut that clean. That allows that transitional shoulder to maintain that integrity and that strength of that junction. Let me go right there. Okay, I've got here, perpendicular. I still have that nice run without that impediment, okay? Open it up to questions as I just clean this up.
Gary has a question. Says, I have some deciduous trees that still have green leaves on them. I'm in Boston. Does that mean I can't do the post-leaf pruning, or when the leaves fall in November, should I do it then?
When the leaves fall in November, you do it then. That's the scope. Now, there's a lot of people across North America that have been saying, hey, we've got some really kind of odd circumstances happening here. I've still got leaves on my stuff. It's going to be getting really, sort of late. Maybe I still have leaves on my trees and we're going to start to see freezing temperatures. What do? I've got leaves on my trees. Can I prune? I've got leaves on my trees. Usually I would have wired them and put them away by now. What do? As long as we're not getting freezing temperatures while the tree still has leaves, the best course of action is to let the tree continue to respond to the environmental cues that trigger its natural transition into dormancy. Hopefully you get some good mild freezing conditions before that tree actually experiences some radical cold, and you get that tree to go through the process of sugar starch reabsorption, etc. But if you have trees that are still in leaf and you get a massive drop in temperature, that's going to be freezing, and that tree has not made that transition, you need to be pulling that tree in and doing the bonsai shuffle. And it is a weird year. It's a weird year for all of us. Typically, we're saying, hey, listen, first, second week of November, we're done with deciduous work. We have been sitting here, scratching our heads, trying to come up with stream topics to be doing while we wait for the deciduous trees to transition, because we're almost a full month delayed in our move towards winter sort of dormancy preparations, etc. It's been very, very wild. I'm glad they're going through it. We're about ready to get freezing temperatures. We've got to be on point and very aware of trees that are still not even remotely sort of transition into their dormant capacity to tolerate those cold conditions.
Bob M. has a question. It says, how winter hardy is Korean hornbeam?
That's a great question. A lot of Korean hornbeam's winter hardiness hinges on the soil mass that exists around the root system. And this is true for almost any broadleaf deciduous tree. We put a lot of our broadleaf deciduous trees in more shallow containers just as a course of action to get the lateral root spread, to see the trunk, girth and the appearance of the scale and proportion of the tree kind of boosted by that container size selection, etc. This is the bonsai model. We understand Korean hornbeam is a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous tree, which means we need to take very, very good care of the sheen of Korean hornbeam. Otherwise, we'll see, most importantly, as a big indicator of a poor sheen, the apex get very, very weak. Or we'll see only a few branches pushing out strong growth in the spring. That's almost inevitably a discussion of a sheen that has got a bad biology that's starting to expand and spread and sort of sour the biology in the rest of the container, right? But when we talk about a sheen-based tree, we're saying, listen, Korean hornbeam does well in a little bit deeper pot, a little bit greater soil mass, a little more cold tolerance, a little more cold hardy, etc. I would let Korean hornbeam go down to, say, 25 degrees in this container before I would even start to think about needing to protect it, okay? But when we start to talk about any deciduous tree, the larger the tree, the more tolerant. When we talk about any deciduous tree, the more strong it was allowed to grow that year in terms of not keeping it in a refined transition of energy, partial defoliation, pruning, smaller leaves, etc. We're not in the refinement process. We're allowing it to blow and go. It's developmental, it's secondary, we get strong growth, etc. Stronger tree, more tolerant to cold. More sugars and starches amassed because it hasn't had to recuperate from a big pruning or a loss of that initial leaf mass. Several things impact that, which then would lead you to say, oh, okay, the more refined a broadleaf deciduous, the less cold tolerant it is, right? So even in a deeper container, I've got a highly, highly ramified Chinese quince, Korean hornbeam, Japanese maple, etc. The temperature that you let older and older, more and more refined and more highly ramified trees endure in the winter needs to decrease in terms of we need to protect them at a much higher temperature than we would if that tree were in a developmental stage, right? So a lot of factors to answer that question that we need to analyze in order to assess. do we need to protect or not? But generally, I use 25 degrees as an arbitrary temperature cutoff for a nice, healthy hornbeam in refinement. Developmental, I've had hornbeam in the garden that are out in the garden at 2 degrees in a developmental container, nursery container, heavy root mass, haven't been pruned, and they're very tolerant. Okay, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a benchmark, but I've experienced that with success, and that's because that tree had the resources to have that cold tolerance.
Roberto has a question and wonders, has this trunk been worked on, or does it bark up like this naturally?
It barks up like this naturally. There is a big characteristic when you're dealing with Korean hornbeam. Jesus, go ahead and just show this little area down here. There's a few little gems here that we kind of see that help us understand that this was most likely a collected tree. Okay, this is a very, very old scar. Korean hornbeam coming out of the mountains. When they're collected, they have a tremendous amount of water flow. And much like a Satsuki azalea coming out of the field, when that major root system is severed out of collection, these big roots are cut. The tree almost shrinks from a reduction of that water flow. Okay, that's what creates some of the muscling and the texture on the trunk where you see those independent water transport veins occurring. It's also what causes some of the scarring, but that reduction of the growth rate is a direct indication that this tree was collected and not grown in a field, where a field would have the ability to more better patch that damage, okay? Even coming out of a field, once you dig a Korean hornbeam out of the field, that transition of that strength from that massive growth capacity to a much smaller root system, severing of larger roots, etc., is going to cause that trunk to shrink and show you that similar muscling. These are indications of collected trees, right? But when we start to see this, when we start to see those things, you know, it's sort of discussed in the bonsai sphere that you want to heal that you want to disguise that you want to do something about that. For Korean hornbeam, I've seen very limited, very few Korean hornbeams in my career in bonsai that have not had a tremendous amount of scar tissue on the trunk as an acceptable part of the Korean hornbeam, aesthetic, just based on the fact that it's a characteristic that comes from harvesting the best collected material.
Matt F. has a question. It says, can the techniques in this stream be applied to Zelkova?
No. The techniques for Zelkova are entirely different, and we're going to walk you through Zelkova. We've got an absolutely smashing Zelkova that we've been working on. It is bright green. It looks like it wants to grow again. It's not even remotely, I don't even know if it's started to change, a single leaf is changing color yet. But when we get to Zelkova, we'll break down Zelkova independently. We've got some ginkgo that I want to work on. We've got a lot of trident maples that are in varying stages of development that I want to show you how to progress with. So many deciduous things, and I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. We're going to be packing the truck next week, trying to go to the Pacific Bonsai Expo, and all of the deciduous trees are going to lose their leaves all at once, and we have these great ambitions of teaching you about every single one of them, and we're going to have to sit there and sort of weigh the pros and cons of each of them and figure out which one we want to dedicate our time to. It's beyond a shadow of a doubt, that's exactly how it's going to go down. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm just cleaning up my branch lines. Now, why am I spending the time to do this? This is a fundamental. Everybody wants to jump on wiring. Like, okay, I got this deciduous tree, leaves are falling, dried up, I got to get wire. I'm going to start wiring. You have got to clean the tree in order to be able to wire effectively. Otherwise, all of these stubs, first of all, you might be wiring branches that are dead, which we want to identify that, okay? But all of these stubs are pitfalls in wiring that when you're using aluminum without that absolute focus contact with the branch, getting the function to hold this tree in its shape and form next year as it phototropically starts to behave over the spring season and the tree starts pumping all of this energy through the foliar mass, it's almost impossible, right? And one of the biggest mistakes I see people make in broadleaf deciduous work is just simply use too light of wire. Now, I'm not saying come back and hit this hornbeam or any broadleaf deciduous with tremendously heavy wire. But we know broadleaf deciduous for the most part, and Korean hornbeam has quite a bit of flexibility, but when they break, right? Japanese maple, trident maple, notoriously brittle. And we're saying, okay, how do you defeat that brittleness if you're going to be wiring them and you're going to be taking advantage of that opportunity to manipulate the shape? You've got to use appropriate wire to move the branch anywhere you want it to go and to hold that movement, almost assuming, right? And the more brittle a tree is, and we'd say Japanese red pine, incredibly brittle pine. How do you bend? How do you wire Japanese red pine? You got to use a little bit heavier wire. So when you bend it to that threshold, it holds and you're not tempted to go back and keep bending and bending, because that's when you get breakage. Hornbeam, maple, any broadleaf deciduous tree, exactly the same. Okay, so I've got to come back in and I've got to clean off all of this detritus that's going to get in the way of functional wiring. It'll look bad if we're wiring over these stubs. It'll cause our wire to lose its function, and that's when we start to jeopardize and compromise. That's when we start to jeopardize and compromise the tree. Okay, I had a bad cut here. I want to bring you in and I want to show you a bad cut. I looked at it, I thought, it's probably at the right angle. I didn't check it out because I'm trying to work fast here. Okay, Jesus, can you focus in on this right here? That little cut right there. Let me go ahead and rotate. Good. Okay, now let me get my hands in the right location. Hang on, that's better. Okay. Now here's the deal. I cut this at a diagonal to the branch. I did not cut this at a perpendicular to leave that nice little edge. Consequently, now right down the middle of that, when I open that up, there's a split because I compromised that structure. There's a split right down the middle of that cut where I've compromised the strength of that shoulder. And if I bend this too much or I bend this without intention, it's going to rip right off right there. Okay? That is the danger of losing focus when we're cleaning, when we're pruning, when we're removing stubs. I needed, instead of having my angle here, watch my fingernail. I needed my angle to be here, right? I had my concave cutters there. I needed my concave cutters to be there to get that perpendicular cut across that branch. Now I've got that diagonal. I decreased the width of that tissue that's supporting this. I actually have a vascular junction that's connected to this that I've exposed, which can atrophy and recede. I've got all kinds of problems there. That's what we want to avoid. That's what I started out saying don't do. You start moving quickly, you're working, right? That's one of the things with pruning broadleaf deciduous trees. You got to be focused the entire time because that can compromise an entire branch. That's all the way back at the base of that secondary. That could compromise that entire branch now, that error that I made. So we want to try and avoid that as much as we can.
Kim has a question and wonders if you could use a Fordham instead of a razor to remove the extra wood on the extended collar.
You can use a Fordham to remove the dead interior wood, Kim. You could use a Fordham with a really sharp gouge and the oscillating gouge to touch the living tissue. You would never want to use a grinding bit. You would never want to use a carbide burr on the living tissue because it just chews it up too bad. And that tissue would then swell. It might actually die and atrophy because of the damage that's done to it and it couldn't be compartmentalized. Or it might swell because so much of the cambial layer has been exposed through that chewing motion of the grind that it's much, much better if we can come back in and we can use a more refined cutting instrument to get that kind of reduction. But the oscillating gouge is an option that if used correctly at the correct angles can give you that kind of clean, really concise cut that can heal well. But you got to be careful with that one.
Treebird Steve asks, is Korean Hornbeam prone to reverse taper at points where more than two leads come together?
Every single species of tree is prone to reverse taper where you've got more than two, okay? But when we talk about our higher water mobility, which broadleaf deciduous are high water mobility, I would say Korean Hornbeam, we've historically talked about Korean Hornbeam inside of the broadleaf, and here we go, Jesus. Go ahead and bring me into this. This is a perfect illustration that the camera can capture. Okay, and I'm going to see, transition. Okay, so watch closely. I'm going to take this off. Okay, now you see this branch. Let me get up in here. See this branch line here, okay? I don't want my concave cutters pruning diagonally along that branch, okay? I want to come in perpendicular. Now watch closely. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take this. Okay, that's the cut that I want. Now I don't want to leave a tremendous stub. If you look here, I didn't leave a stub. It's flush on the bottom of this shoulder. Okay, but we come in, we come up into that solid shoulder, and then we continue on the transport of that branch. I have no structural compromise by coming perpendicular to that branch when I cut it. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, that's the correct way to fix that error in the cleaning process. And it's going to empower me to be able to wire better without fear, without causing damage, without unduly breaking branches that I really want and find a value in the shape of the tree. There's nothing worse than mispruning a tree, coming back and wiring, or mispruning a tree and putting your hands in it, and then you see this branch hanging here, and you see this branch hanging here, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm destroying this tree. It's true, right? Pruning is a major tool and a major mechanism by which we can really positively alter the state of the tree, or we can dramatically disempower and disable the state of the tree. Okay, now, up until this point, as I've been sitting here pruning some of these areas in the lower branching structure, etc., there's a good solid, and let me just go ahead and get rid of some of these people, these branches, okay? There's a really good solid structure that's existed. There's no structural flaws that we see. Treebeard Steve says, hey man, can these swell at areas of 3? Absolutely, and because they're higher water mobility trees, they particularly swell in groups of 3, right? Now, hornbeam, I would say, is slower to thicken. We see that with the way that the wounds sort of heal or fail to heal on a collected tree. But on a younger hornbeam, they absolutely will swell and form big, massive inverse taper, okay? So when we start to look at that, up to this point, we've had a really good run of good solid structure in the lower branches of the tree. But up in the apex here, we've got this sort of dilapidated kind of ball of branching. And I've got literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got another knuckle, 6, 7. I've got this one that's kind of sticking in here. I mean, I've got a lot of stuff. You see that kind of nodule of branches up here. And I've got to start to make decisions on that, okay? Now, first and foremost, let me give you the full rotation now that it's cleaned up and without leaves. I'm proposing that this is our front. We repotted this tree this year. This is a client's tree. We radically altered the planting angle, okay? I like the backside as well. I think this is a beautiful trunk line. Apex leans away from us a little bit, and we've got kind of a funky root. We stare directly at that big wound. Let me just sort of, in 2 dimensions, looking at the, yeah, there's some really good vibes right here. We see a flawless trunk. We see a good distribution of the Nabari without the grotesque straight piece here. We don't have to stare directly at the wound, which I'm not opposed to. I'm not a purist in the traditional sense of broadleaf deciduous trees, but if we can avoid sitting there staring at a wound, even in the modern form of bonsai, you still want to be looking at bark as opposed to a big, ugly, artificial wound. Now, natural hollow, natural deterioration, we're talking feature at this point. Doesn't have it. Am I going to carve it into it? No, I'm not going to put carving tools on this tree. I'll only do more harm than good. I'll only do more harm than good from my perspective. Now, I understand, there's Will Baddeley, there's, who's the gentleman in the UK?
Harry Harrington.
Harry Harrington, talented woodworkers, talented wood carvers taking, really simple material and through the carving process, carving in taper, carving hollows dead. I love it. I'm not poo-pooing that. This is a situation where you've got this big hollow, you've got living branches all around, or this big wound, you've got living branches all around it. Is this a moment where I'm going to carve in a collected Korean hornbeam? Go ahead and bring me in there. Okay, is this a moment where I'm going to carve in a collected Korean hornbeam hollows through this old bark that's living from a collected tree that came out of South Korea and was imported long ago? Absolutely not. I collect a native hornbeam from the southeastern United States. Am I going to take that approach? Sure. Big stump cut piece? Absolutely. But there's a difference between the handling of those 2 scenarios, and in this case, I would prefer to leave it as is. Pick the front that gives me the best possible trunk line perspective, branching structure, etc., and start to really rock out and work from that. Okay, the other piece of this, from this front, this lowest branch, which I find to contribute to the value of the structure dramatically, is leaning towards us as opposed to leaning away from us in the back as a backwards feature of that piece. This is challenging, not out of the question. We could use it, but it's challenging. So why do I belabor this point? Because when I look at this nodule of branches at the top, I'm utilizing that perspective of orientation of the front to begin to make selections, right? I have my natural continuation of taper and thickest element here creating the apical region. Let me just get these last leaves off here, okay? I know I want this. Now behind that, I start to get into this amalgamation, okay? Now off of this, if I have structural flaws, I've got kind of one, I would say a little puny knuckle here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reduce that and I'm going to call it good. That's an easy one, okay? No problems there. I like that. That didn't take much of our time or energy, okay? I've got this piece that's contributing here. This and this are coming off of the same junction. This one is thicker. This one is growing on top of this piece, and these two pieces are growing at a junction that is radically swelling, okay? I've got another branch that's in that same area, and I've got this branch that comes across the front and is opposing those, causing it to continue to swell and continue to thicken, okay? So I've got to look at this whole thing holistically, and I've got to start to say, okay, so this is very straight, it's very long, this is on the outside of an elbow, that's pretty sweet, this is pretty nice. I could use this, watch this, I can use this piece to come across and hide this piece. This is growing opposed to a piece that's filling in a hole back here that I ideally would like to use. Awesome. I'm going to take that piece off. I'll come back and cleanly cut that. Okay, that's one. That's one structural flaw that I've removed. I've got several more. Let's keep going, okay? So I've got one structural flaw down. I know I'm going to keep this piece because now I made that decision to reduce that branch knowing that this was going to be used. I have this piece as my upper apical region. Get rid of this knot, okay? So I've got this back piece here, and I've got a lot of things happening in this back piece. Now, Jesus, can you see into this little 1, 2, 3, 4 area? Yeah, beautiful. Bring me in there. Good, okay? So this is my apex here. This is a piece that we said we're going to use to fill the hole. You're looking from the right side of the tree. Okay, I've got this, 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 and this. I've got 4 of these, right? If this is of value, then I'm looking across here and I'm saying, gosh, is this occurring at the same junction as that? It kind of is. Is it occurring at the same junction as that? Not really, but this one's bridging the gap between here and these two. If I tried to make the most minimal move on a tree of this age that would have the most maximum effect on decreasing the formation of structural flaws, do I remove 1, 2, 3, or 4? And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, I'm going to remove number 2. Watch closely. I'm going to remove this one. Stay in with me. Okay, now this is hard. Okay, because watch this. I'm going to leave that branch where it's at. Okay, I'm going to take that piece off. You see which one we removed here? That gives me space. Gives me space between number 1 and number 3 and 4 here. Now, go ahead and zoom out, Josh. Okay, watch closely, because this is a really painful piece to be removing. When you fall in love with branches, you start to make compromised decisions. Love is very deceptive. Now watch closely. Ouch, ouch, ow. That was, look at the butt cut that I've got in my tree's apex now. That's tough. That's a tough move. I'm not even done yet. I'm not done yet, because guess what? Either this one or this one have to go as well. Oh, gosh. Are you serious? That one or that one? And I've got this one coming towards the back. Man, I am really, really challenged to make a move that makes sure that I can perpetuate the health and the quality of this tree, the integrity of the structure, etc. Now, some of you are focused on, wait, but you showed us that branch where there's kind of opposing pieces here, okay? Go ahead and come in. Yes, nice. Okay, slightly offset. Let me just, yeah, there we go. Slightly offset, slightly forward, slightly back. We took out the major swelling here. I've got this branch here. I've got beautiful spacing between that branch and the next branch below it. Now, I can remove this piece, I can remove this piece, or I can remove this piece, right? This is the most dominant piece by far. Best movement, and it's contributing to the apex. This is the piece that causes me the most problems yet again. Guess what? Okay, now, stay there, Josh, zoom out. Okay, painful here. Go ahead and bring me into the wide shot. Wide shot. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going to come all the way over here. All the way over, all the way over, all the way over. Ouch, ouch, ouchie, right? Now we're sitting here going, oh, okay. So Ryan's teaching us how to basically butcher a deciduous tree. No, no, because here's what's happening. All of these big, long branches here at the top are very powerful. They've got interior growth. All the branches down low, the shape needs to change, and they need to have sustainable design applied if these are going to contribute to the shape. If I don't start by redefining the line in the apical region of the tree and shrinking down the size of that otherwise gigantic dome, then I have a massive, massive issue trying to determine what to do with these lower branches. This is where branch elimination to determine design, I say it all the time. Listen, you can wire or you can be able to prune and clean. Which one's more important? Pruning sets you up for wiring. Wiring does not set you up to fix structural flaws and satisfy the necessity of pruning. You've got to be able to prune first to be able to set yourself up for successful design, okay? So we're making major, major progress here. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna take this back on the shoulder. I've got one more. And this is a killer here. Okay, I'm gonna come back to the same situation. Jesus, go ahead and bring me into this area so we can see the progression. Go ahead and show it to me when you got it. Great. Up a little bit. See those cut sites? Keep going up, keep going up. All right, okay. I took off this one. That was the butt cut. I took off this one. That one really caused a butt cut. Now I've got this one, okay? I've got here, I've got here. I've got a nice spacing here before I get there. I can't take off. I can't go too far. And these are not causing a major structural flaw. Slightly forward, slightly back, different planes, not causing too much to occur. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna fix this. In the future, am I gonna have to fix that? I'm gonna have to fix that. What's gonna allow me to take this off? Getting the branches below it down here to be healthy out on the tips, okay? But this one's the last one to go, and then I'm set up. I have branches that can be moved into that area. Bam, gotta go, gots to go. Okay, and when we first received this tree, and let me come back in with just a nice little knuckle cutter here, good, solid, clean. Make that nice and clean. Okay. When we first received this tree, it needed a repot fairly badly, okay? Because the root system was not set up for the branches to regain health. It was in a little bit of a poor substrate, and it was struggling a little bit. We don't want to be trying to prune to empower lower branches on a tree that isn't healthy. How do I know this tree is healthy then after the repot? Because you can see the vigorous, abundant, big branches up high on the tree that are running. Go ahead and bring me back out to the wide. These pieces right here, these are showing me that we've regained vigor. Okay, I've got those leaders out on these lower branches as well. They're just not getting the sunlight. We're recovered, okay? I didn't prune this. I didn't partially defoliate this. You know, you say, oh man, do you let these leaders build? You know, wouldn't these cause further weakening? Well, it's a trade-off with broadleaf deciduous. If I don't build the energy in the system, I can't fix the weakness that exists. So I've got to build the strong while watching the weak and sort of making sure it's staying, rotation, right? Trying to do my very best because I can't start pruning back the strong until I've rebuilt the epicenter of strength or the conductivity in the root system, okay? It's a balance. There's no black or white there. It's a gray process to rebuild the energy. Now that we're rebuilt though, we're set to go. Structural flaws have been taken away. Your clarity. Notice the clarity when I point here of the upper apical region, the movement that exists through that upper apical region. Again, I'm just taking off a few more little pieces here. The movement that exists through here now has been greatly accentuated. Now we start the process of working from the bottom of the tree. Okay, I'm going to put some wire on these pieces. You're going to notice that I'm not going to be wiring the big structural meaty parts of these branches for the most part. And in order to handle this lowest branch, let me show you again. In order to handle this, I've got to first adjust orientation here, okay? So I'm going to start the process here. These are going to start crashing into the ones above it, and we're going to start to build that length reference starting with our defining branch or that lowest piece that starts to set the tone for style as well as length to get that sustainable design. I'll open it up to questions as I start to dig in.
Danny asks, can we get a little history on this tree and how it came to Mirai?
I wish I had more history than just saying it came here as part of, and Jeff Shahovsky, if he's in the chat, would be able to explain the history of this way better than me. Came here as part of a public collection that was sort of, pressing pause on the curatorial component of it. And just came here to have some of the routine work done, etc. But we saw it. Hey, listen, the hornbeam, this tree is a spectacular piece that we need to do some work on if it's going to continue to be a spectacular representation of the species. Okay, I'm going to be raising these branches in the broadleaf deciduous form, taking them away from that sort of coniferous downward weakening tips down. So I want to be starting my structural work from the bottom. I want to be starting my structural work from the bottom, meaning my wire starts on the bottom and comes up over, right? If I want a lower coniferous form, I want my wire here. If I'm going to raise and I have my druthers, I want to start on the bottom, because when I pick this branch up, it's going to want to return down. If it's on the top, picks it up. If it's on the bottom, pushes it into the branch and gives me holding capacity, okay? So I wish I had more information than that, Danny, but what I got is that this is an old collected hornbeam out of Korea. I have a lot of experience with these. Even though Mr. Kimura wasn't a deciduous specialist, we had some of the best Korean hornbeams in the back of his nursery that I saw in all of Japan.
Kurt is up next and says, do all Korean hornbeams have a drooping nature like this one? All random, 7 of mine are.
No, they don't have a drooping nature. And in fact, I would say if you look at the growth of Korean hornbeam, if you've wired all of the branching down, they're absolutely going to droop. Look at the vigorous growth of Korean hornbeam. Look at this. I mean, it's phototropic as all get out. Notice the strength in the branching up here, the ramification, the size of the buds, the reduced internode, and then you look at the buds on the tip of this lower area here where there's virtually no strength. I mean, bring me in there, Josh. The contrast of the two is shocking. That is so weak right there. And notice they're trying to grow up. Yeah, good. That's a beautiful contrast. All right, nicely done, Josh. Okay, they're trying to grow up. They're trying to phototropically change orientation. They're like, God, get us, and it's got these bigger branches. Like, no, it's not set up for success. We've got to change the system in order to be able to save these lower pieces.
Gary asks, how come this tree is in an unglazed pot?
Choice of the client. We strongly encouraged a stronger container aesthetic, which, I have to say, I do find when we deal with traditional species, I'm not going to be putting this in some radical Western container. I don't find that to be both respectful, and I also don't find it to be flattering for the trees. Okay, now here we start to see this bumping in. Notice what we have here. This is bumping into this space. Okay, now we've cut some really big pieces out of the upper canopy here. And go ahead and pull me back to the big camera, Josh. Okay, so we've cut some space out of right here. You see that space. Now the way that I fill that space is I need to swing this branch very slowly. Okay, I can't just crank it. It's not a conifer. That can break. I swing that branch up into that area. That creates the room and the space for me to swing this branch up into this area. Guess what that just did? Opened up the space for this branch to exist in that location. So when I'm working on broadleafs like this and I'm setting structure, we're trying to buy the room down here. I'm creating some chaos here. I'm going to jump to the upper apical region to move some of those pieces to build in that space so that I can finish setting this. Once this is set, then I have the room to set my defining branch. It's a backwards process to actually get to the stylistic handling of the defining branch, but with a broadleaf deciduous, phototropic, cytokinin, up, out as your natural growth habit, I've got to be moving pieces up that are hanging down over those branches that are losing that strength with that inappropriate angle. And I say inappropriate from a horticultural, physiological level, inappropriate for healthy, sustainable design.
Jeff is in the chat, so we'll just share this to anybody who's not looking. He said the trees that were brought up to Mirai from Santa Barbara were originally part of the bonsai display at the Chicago Botanical Gardens. Owner was no longer able to care for them, gave them to friends to have, and they have a home in California. This was one of those trees. They're rebuilding the house, and it's best to remove the trees to a secure location during the rebuild.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I knew they had been, I knew they had been part of a collection at some point in time. And the Korean Hornbeam, there's some great trees in the collection. They have a ginkgo that's a really unique tree. The Satsuki azalea that we worked on and did the redesign of was also from this collection and is doing quite well as a result of that work. But the Hornbeam was the one that was like, ooh, you have a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous whose sheen is clearly struggling. You have a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous that's very, very old and needs a boost. This was the one that I found to be the most challenging, but also this had the greatest potential in that collection because of the fact that you just simply cannot find collected Korean hornbeam as bonsai. You just simply can't find this kind of material anymore. This is very, very rare, very, very rare. This used to be as common as punch, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, early mid 90s, this stuff was being imported like with the Miyajima white pines as if it were, you know, commonplace. And now all of a sudden they're all gone and everybody's like, oh man, I want Korean Hornbeam, I want Korean Hornbeam. It's like most of the good Korean Hornbeam that existed in the world unfortunately suffered the fate of being kind of the martyrs for Korean Hornbeam. And now we've not necessarily got the scraps, but we have the trees that have survived despite, not as a result of, but despite our efforts and our sort of mishandlings. And that's okay. That's okay as long as we learn our lessons and we progress these trees moving forward, okay? I'm going to continue in this apical region just because I'm having success starting to turn some of these pieces into very, very usable and redirected forms. I'm going to stay here and then I'm going to drop back down. This is still just structure. As long as I'm wiring branches that are coming from the trunk and I'm adjusting major primary lines, we call this work structural. Okay, and we'll keep on with the questions.
Paul and Oregon Jeff are both wondering, how easy does Korean Hornbeam air layer?
Not very easy. Okay, not to say that it doesn't, but it's a much drier tissue. And again, think about this. We said, hey, listen, Korean Hornbeam does not necessarily rapidly heal. It doesn't rapidly heal. It doesn't produce robust callus. Now, younger trees, younger Korean Hornbeams that have, you know, less of that accumulated loss of vascular conductivity from woody tissue taking over their really clear and transparent waterways in the xylem and the heartwood, the cortex, the core of the tree as it matures. Younger trees have the ability to be air layered with far more success. Or, you know, in the case of the hornbeam raft that we're creating, which may make another appearance this fall, we'll see how the timing for everything works out. Ambitions are high, okay? In the case of the Korean Hornbeam, they have that flexible malleability in their cambial layer and vascular tissue to be able to produce, you know, roots in a layer or something of that nature. But when you get to an old tree like this, getting this thing to take from an air layer is almost, I'm not going to say it's impossible, I'm going to say it's almost impossible. Because now at this point, you do not have a robust transport of water. You do not have abundant vascular productivity. So if you're ever asking yourself, does that tree air layer, you've got to be looking at how well does the tissue swell, callus, and heal. That's an immediate discussion of how well it will air layer.
Shoheen Stig is up next and says, what are the dormancy requirements for Korean Hornbeam? Does Southern California have winters that are too warm?
That's a good question. I'm sure that Southern California, David, do you have Korean Hornbeam? Yeah? Yeah? So David's from San Diego. He's got Korean Hornbeam. He gave the thumbs up. He said, hey, yeah, definitely. And I remember seeing them at the Winter Silhouette Show in Los Angeles when I was in college. I think Khan and Kei Komai had a Winter Silhouette Show. I haven't seen a lot of hornbeam in recent memory, but I wonder if it's more because hornbeam were maybe treated like Japanese maple in the repotting process. The sheen was probably treated in an inappropriate way. All of a sudden, you know, on an aging tree that's been a bonsai for a long time, we get that atrophy of the apex. All of a sudden, we've got branching issues, and you got a lot of Korean hornbeams that have been sort of deconstructed through a misunderstanding of the sheen-based root system on the broadleaf deciduous model. I'm guessing that's why we probably haven't seen them. Much like, you know, the California junipers, you pinch them, you repot them too aggressively, and there aren't a lot of good California junipers. We're learning. That's the whole martyr discussion that I was talking about. Okay, I'm working on this defining branch finally. I've cleared the space. Let's see if we can get this into a position where it can sustainably exist. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of intermittently prune wire, kind of reduce proportions, cut back stronger areas, establish thresholds, direct and guide the branching. And we're going to mix the techniques to work through the secondary, tertiary process. But let me go ahead. This one's going to be probably the most brittle, it being the weakest, having the lowest sap flow, and having the greatest amount of deadwood and knobs and stubs that we've cut off.
Kathy asks, would American Hornbeam have a similar structure, the lower branches dropping and the branches rising as you go up the trunk?
Okay, so I want to reiterate and emphasize, this is not a good structure. This is a structure that we're changing in this tree, okay? You do not want the lower branches hanging down. That's why they're weak and declining. I'm actually going to take these and I'm bringing them up. I've just had to bring up all of these branches to create the space to bring up the rest of them. So I want to be very, very clear. I'm changing this structure. This is a traditional structure that's destined to fail. I'm changing it, okay? Because it's not sustainable over the course of time, especially as the design ages, right? This is a design, even in Japan, that is challenging to maintain strength. You fight the traditional model in the growth habit of the tree, and ultimately it will continue to degrade, decline, and lose quality with those branches facing downwards, okay? It's just a part of the aging tree model when the natural growth habit of the broadleaf deciduous is up and out as opposed to down and out.
Ricky D asks, have you tried thread grafting on older Korean hornbeams?
I have thread grafted on older Korean hornbeams. Again, if you do not have abundant vascular productivity, if you don't have really strong callousing, healing capacity, etc., how is a thread graft supposed to produce the vascular tissue that's going to unite a brand new addition to its sugar starch supply and its water demands, right? It's challenging. It's a big ask. Is it possible? Possible. Totally possible, okay? But much like any other technique, the more difficult that it becomes, the more accurate your technique needs to be. If you're going to thread graft a Korean hornbeam, you have got to be absolutely on point. Precise, sharp tools, expert execution of the technique to get it to work. Okay, now, we're just adjusting this initial branch. Go ahead and let me show you what that looks like, okay? Notice how I brought that up. Now, I'm bringing it up. I'm not just taking it, and I'm not just going here and leaving it straight. I'm bringing it, into that space so that it's got some of the similar motion and movement. Bringing that tip up. Notice how these are pointing down now, okay? Bringing that tip up is exactly what empowers that branch to have the same capacity and dog in the fight as the rest of the branches on the tree, right? That's where the change in the shape needs to take place. That's what I want you to walk away with tonight when you walk away from this stream, is broadleaf deciduous are going to struggle over the course of time. We talked about it with the ume styling, and people wire ume branches out flat and those branches atrophy and die. You wire those tips up and they thrive. That ume is absolutely crushing. It had a great year this year. So being sure that we understand that physiological response to orientation change, which ultimately becomes a hormonal distribution issue in the broadleaf deciduous model, is how we go about developing the technique and the aesthetic appreciation to alter that state of that tree's existence.
Bentley has a question and says, my field growing Korean hornbeam is ready to be chopped. Do I chop it around the leaf drop timing, or do I wait until the buds swell?
In the field, let's see, let me think about that. In the field, I would say that you probably are going to have a much better time. And this depends on how cold of winters you get, and where you're at, Bentley, you don't get cold winters. So I would say you could absolutely cut it as the leaves drop without ill effect where you're at. If you're in a cold winter area, though, you definitely in the field want to be waiting until the spring, or more ideal than the spring, after first flush hardens off, late spring, early summer. That prevents pathogens that exist in colder, wetter spring areas, colder winter areas from getting into the tree in the spring, which for maples in the Pacific Northwest is almost certain death, right? Pseudomonas is gonna chew that tree up and destroy it completely, okay? But it also, doing that pruning after the first flush hardens really redirects sap flow when the tree is already producing a tremendous amount of resources and you're in the field, which is a different timing mechanism. I'd be curious to bring Chris and Gary back if they were ever interested and have a deciduous growing discussion, because they just really altered my perspective of growing pines in the Telperian podcast. That would be a dream if we can make that happen.
Chris is up next and says, when did this hornbeam's leaves start turning? My trees have yet to change. I'm here in Seattle. Presume this is not an issue.
Well, Chris, it's not an issue unless we get one of those notorious Arctic cold fronts that blows down right around, second, third week of November, and that's always my fear. Last year we had a slightly later fall. This year, yet again later. That's always my fear, because if the trees have not gone through their natural transition into dormancy and we get one of those really brutal cold snaps, you know, that causes I-5 to shut down and school to be canceled and all that stuff, then that can be a real deal breaker for these deciduous trees that haven't made that transition. In that case, you would need to bring trees that haven't gone full color change, that haven't lost their leaves. You would need to protect them. This one started turning, I'm going to say, 7-10 days ago, maybe? It happened pretty quick, didn't it?
Yes, maybe a little more than that.
Maybe a little more, maybe 2 weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago max. Yeah, it wasn't. The fall color on the trees at Mirai has not. They've changed quick. It hasn't lasted long. It's been a pretty lackluster fall, in all honesty. Okay, so I'm just kind of working, and you know, when broadleaf deciduous trees, when we're bending a brittle broadleaf deciduous tree, we don't necessarily feel them snap. I mean, they will snap, right? But we more or less feel that vascular tissue sort of, you know, there's a little bit of, especially as they're reallocating resources in the fall, they have more malleability. Best time to be wiring Japanese maple, if you're in an area that's not too cold in terms of experiencing like below 0 temperatures, best time to be wiring right about now, because you have more flexibility in the branches than any other time in the year. And I mean any other time in the year right now. Same thing for hornbeam, same thing for tamarisk, same thing for these really brittle deciduous trees, okay? So now that I've gotten to this point, I've gotten these pieces sort of slightly picked up. Before I start pruning, I want to make sure that I get that shape put into that branch. It's very tempting, right, when we're trying to avoid that final commitment. You see me sort of tinkering with this tree because I just had a little light sort of stress, sort of, what would I say, fracture, if you will, which on a weaker branch is very nerve-wracking, okay? You want to go ahead and you want to solidify those positions before you come back and you start kind of pruning and reducing. Because if you have a major break, if you have a major issue, you would want to be leaving more on that branch. Now, this is a perfect example. I wired this. I got a little bit of a stress break. I want to cut it all the way back to here. Can you bring me in tight, Josh? I want to cut it all the way back to here. I've got this big long piece. Notice this big long piece. It's sitting over these pieces, okay? But I had a little bit of a break. Now I've got a finer piece of ramification here, but I have a really nice strong bud in transition here. I'm going to cut back to that strong bud where I have that really nice, beautiful, you can kind of see that really nice, beautiful, strong terminal piece right there, which starts to determine how much do I need to be wiring to be able to shape this and have control over that. I'm going to carry my wire out a little bit farther than I thought because I want to have control of that branch as a result of the necessity based on that tear and based on that little bit of damage, right? I want this branch to thrive. This is a great interior branch. If I take this interior branch off, I'm not going to have anything on the interior. I've got some small buds starting to pop right here. Let me show you what that looks like now, okay? Now that branch is starting to work like the rest of the branches on the tree. Okay, let me get through some of this. I'm going to start to reduce, and then we'll start to really prune. I'm thinking about these branches that exist above it, and I'm also strongly considering the size of this part of the canopy. Okay.
Danny had this question earlier, and it's kind of been answered by the work, but will you be using copper or aluminum wire on this tree? Maybe you can just talk about why.
Yeah, sure. So when I first style a young broadleaf deciduous tree, I'm all about using the copper wire, right? We paper wrap it to protect the bark. We do the big heavy bends, and we know that I can get more bend with copper wire than I can with aluminum, right? It work hardens. I can push the branches much farther. I want to take them as far as I possibly can in that first working so that I can only build on that from that point moving forward. Okay, so that's when I use copper. Once I've done that initial styling and design, I don't need that sort of strength of copper. I don't need that capacity of copper nearly as much. Okay, and that's when I start to back off and start to work with aluminum, because working with the aluminum allows me to just be a lot softer, a lot more delicate, a lot more nuanced with my bends, with the handling of those branches, etc. And that's really when we start to fine-tune the broadleaf form. Okay, so I'm kind of working through that piece right there, just sort of setting, and I want those informal, billowy masses starting to sort of exist as their own informal sort of areas on the tree, but still bringing those tips up, okay? Don't judge that too much because we're still working. Let's come to this side over here.
Roberto has a question and says, this tree has an excellent overall branching. How many years ago do you think it was set in this style?
I'm guessing that this tree, like I said, I think this is probably between 80, I think this tree is probably, let me pull back. Let me just say maybe this tree is 65 and 80 years old in the mountains. 65, 80 years old, probably collected in the mountains when it was 40, 45, maybe 50. So it's probably been loosely being grown as a bonsai, trained as a bonsai. It was probably a stump when it came out. These are branches that disproportionately shot from shoots that came from the trunk that was chopped. And this tree was grown over, 20, 30 years. But the branching that we're seeing, sort of past its prime long ago, right? Had some health issues past its prime. And now we're at a point where we're strengthening the sheen. We get that root system rebuilt. We see that vigorous growth. And now at a point where we can rebalance the energy. We're coming back in. We're making major structural pruning decisions. And we're starting to reset the branching system of the tree. This is an important sort of cadence to the work and the life cycle of bonsai that we've all got to understand, right? This isn't a new tree. This isn't an initial styling. This is a tree that's been a bonsai for a while. When we have trees that have been bonsai for a while, what does that mean? It means that they've experienced the constrictive nature of the containerized environment. They've experienced reduction. It means we have to be calculated. Calculation, because I have a little split here, I can't cut back as far on that branch. That's calculated moves, knowing that this has been a bonsai. It's not coming out of the field with that abundant, youthful vigor and capacity, right? Really interesting when you start digging into the nuances of handling a young, fresh tree off the initial block versus a tree that's been in a bonsai container for a long time. Two totally different skill sets.
David has a question and said, this is from a little bit earlier, on the don't prune it like this branch, could you illustrate that point with the concave cutters or show the area maybe?
Okay. I'm going to go here. Jesus, can you just show this whole branch right here? And let's just take a look at this, because this is where there was just a slight tear. Okay, slight tear, I put some cut paste on this, all right? Now, out here at the tip, right, I wanted to prune this branch back right here. I wanted to prune it back into these finer pieces. I've got this, I've got this. These are super weak and fine, okay? I went ahead and I left this big coarse tip because I have 3 vigorous buds at the tip of this. That's the first really strong shoot that I had. I don't want this to be this long, but I need that energy present on this piece. Even though it's a broadleaf deciduous, they're capable of being cut back behind where leaves are only when the tree is young, vigorous, healthy, built up, in development. This is a tree that's in a bonsai pot, been in a bonsai pot, will continue to be in a bonsai pot. I have to exercise that kind of caution when I have little breaks, damages, tears, etc., especially in a weaker lower branch.
Joe's asking if these principles, including the wiring techniques, apply to maple trees that are losing their leaves now.
The timing, the thought process, and some of the broader broadleaf deciduous knowledge does have some application to maples, potentially. I want to be careful to say, yeah, no, this applies to maples, because it doesn't necessarily apply to maples. It depends on what part of it you're talking about would apply to maples. But there are some ideas of timing. There are some ideas of prolonged existence inside of a bonsai container, changing the behavior of the tree for sure. Okay, now down here, I'm actually concerned that this lowest branch is already gone. It doesn't have any real strong buds. The branching is still flexible. And there are some very, gosh, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if this lives. I'm not going to plan. I see some buds popping, and maybe the cutback on the rest of this tree will assist this piece in making it, but it is a very, very weak branch. Okay, so I'm going to position it, but I'm not going to tamper too much with that piece. I'm going to focus more on the vigorous pieces that exist over here in this region. How are we doing on time?
7:06.
Great.
Treebeard Steve's following up on the American Hornbeam questions from earlier. He said, do you have any experience with them? And if so, what significant similarities do you find?
Do I have any experience with American Hornbeam? I have experience with American Hornbeam stumps. And I've said this before. I've talked about it on a podcast. Sorry, I'm just looking for the right mojo here. I guess I'll use this one. Okay, I've talked about it on podcast. I think there's tremendous opportunity inside of our native, especially in the southeastern, northeastern United States, where the deciduous model is the predominant model, and the coniferous model is, relegated to a few odd species of, random pines that haven't really been bonsai'd, which I'm not saying those are void of quality. I think spruce pine, loblolly, some of those I've talked about in detail. The short needle pine in the southeastern United States has a lot of potential. But the broadleaf model there is so strong. There's so much potential there. There's beech, there's hornbeam, there's all kinds of varieties of deciduous and broadleaf trees that could be utilized. Collecting good trunks, and this is what happened in Japan with the hornbeam craze, is collecting good trunks, planting them in the field to grow out some of those wounds, to grow out branching that has proportion, to heal, to invigorate a tree that's been separated and sort of gone through that dramatic transition, to work the roots so that you're able to create a really beautiful root system and sort of structure for the perpetual quality of that tree's image and aesthetic. I think there's a untapped potential for somebody to take on that work and use collected trees from that region and then plant them in the ground and start to actually do the work to make them good for bonsai. There's a massive whole gap in the industry of bonsai in North America. This could happen in Europe too with cork oaks. This could happen with a number of Quercus species in Europe if people wanted to take the time to actually collect and then grow out the trees post-collection. So yes, I think the hornbeams in the southeastern United States have tremendous potential.
Moon's wondering what you think about the age of the pieces are that you took off the apex area earlier.
I'm guessing that these pieces, I'm going to say these are right around that 20, 25, 30-year-old kind of mark to get that kind of age and thickness on a stump grown collected hornbeam. Yeah, I think I'm right in the wheelhouse. Okay, now I'm at a point here where I've sort of set structure. I've given position to these. I don't feel like I can push these any farther, being weaker lower branches. I'm still very much sort of relegated to the length that exists over here. Now I can use these branches laterally, and I will detail wire this tree. Okay, but I have this upper portion that's sort of looming largely over this lower section that's not sustainable in terms of the design. And bear in mind, when we reclaim a tree like this, we don't cut it back and then it buds from the interior and all of a sudden everything's okay. We've got to be careful. I've got to be respectful of these lower branches. I'm not cutting these back even if they look too long now, but the vigor builds buds that are going to start popping on the interior that start to build the strength in a tree that is a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous and is in a bonsai container for a prolonged period of time, which means it doesn't have the strength to have everything hacked back. And we've got to respect time in the container, okay? But I have this big, long, kind of leggy branch right here. It's been weak growing underneath this incredibly strong branch above it. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take this off to create a little bit of space, knowing that I've got good health. And here's the other thing that I have. When I have big, strong trees, Jesus, can you come in here? I've got the light just highlighting those little buds. Okay, can you come in even closer? Is it possible, or are you maxed out? Okay, you can see this little bud. Let me just see if I can kind of rotate it. There's one right here at my fingertip, and there's one right there at the shoulder. Okay, those buds are proactively existing. I have a bud on the bottom side of this piece right here. I could continue to use this. Now notice that I've got a very small shoulder here. I've got a piece existing right over the top. This is not set up for success. Any way we go about it to move it out from under it is going to be to hide the front of the tree. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come back here. Now watch where I cut. I've identified buds. Here's another bud here. Here's another bud here. I don't want to just cut this off Hornbeam has a hard time compartmentalizing. When I reduce these, I want to leave these buds to conduct water and generate leaf mass next year, even though I know I'm coming back to the shoulder. I've got a bud at the shoulder that's going to grow as a result of that. When that bud at the shoulder grows, I can take this back to the collar in the post-flush harden, partial defoliation, and pruning. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to give that a nice little dab of callus mate to sort of slow. And callus mate, you know, we're hesitant on maples if the maple has a real coarse sort of swelling habit. On a hornbeam that has a real limited capacity to compartmentalize, I love callus mate. This is the best thing you could be using. Okay, so that starts to open the door. Now, I've got these big branches. You're looking at the side of the tree. Let me orient you again. Now we're here. I've got these massive branches. Look at how far forward towards the front these extend. This is a healthy, healthy branch, okay? I am going to be bringing this back to strong buds on the interior, but finer interior pieces so that I can start to reduce the stronger areas and push the strength back. This gets light down to the branches below here. I've got good ramification to transition to. I've got good solid buds that are occurring along the branching of this tree. I like to do these pieces of cutback when I've got the strength built up and these pieces have significant strength, okay? So I'm gonna push pretty hard in the reduction of this to start to get as much quality back into the interior as I possibly can, right? And the more that I can get these reduced, the greater the photosynthetic capacity of the pieces that exist below them, and the more we start to reclaim that proportion that allows for sustainable design to move forward.
Eric P. asks, did the branches that you removed in the apex have collars on them? And if not, do you expect any dieback from those cuts? And Joe had a similar question about the deep cuts. Are you using cement, cut paste, callus made to fill and shape the wounds? Concerned about the trunk rotting over time?
I'm not concerned about the trunk rotting because it'll just lead to hollows, and I like hollows in my broadleaf deciduous trees. I am using callus mate, but I'm cutting back to collars or I'm cutting back to stubs, okay? Weak branches, I'm cutting back to stubs to allow them to compartmentalize. Strong branches with a collar in the upper apex, which is where the primary structure joins that actual trunk, there's collars on all of those, I'm cutting back to the collar. If I were cutting massive, massive branches off, I would be very, very conservative, cutting them back, always cutting back to a stub where there's active buds that are conducting moisture, etc. So there's a mixture of scenarios here, strong and weak, but where I've got strong pieces, I am not hesitant in being fairly aggressive in the cutbacks that I'm making, okay? And I'm looking at this as far as, okay, how am I gonna handle the sort of the creation or the generation of interior branching? I have a little bit of wire that I can start to do. I can sort of work these pieces down and into these regions to start to close the gap, but I still need to reduce fairly significantly. So as I sit here and I just sort of take these stubs off, really what I'm doing is I'm just kind of looking, observing, I'm finding those buds, I'm seeing those vigorous interior areas. I'm gonna keep pushing. If I find vigorous interior areas, I'm gonna seize the moment to cut back to those, okay? So when I get up into here, now I've got a lot more length, I've got a lot more capacity to cover and sort of shade out this lower portion as much as I possibly can, as much as I can possibly prune back. Where I see healthy buds, where I see interior growth. These are upward growing pieces. They're naturally stronger. They're naturally producing a lot more strength, a lot more growth, etc. I want to cut back to these. And the reason I want to cut back first is because I don't want to put wire on anything I don't need to, right? If I can avoid putting wire on it, chances are it causes less stress to the tree over the course of time. But I am not afraid to wire if I can utilize that piece and start to direct that piece's growth, okay? So you see the length of these pieces here. Can I move those back into the interior? Can they structurally play a role in this in a structurally sound way? If they can't, I've got to reduce them. If they can, I've got to wire and I've got to move them. And I'm looking and some can and some can't. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work on the wiring of this area. That reduction already, and this is going to be reduced significantly more, but that reduction already is starting to help with that process and that change of scale. You're going to watch this area show the greatest amount of length shortening over the course of the work tonight.
Bentley asks, is that hollow where it had a major chop filled with something to help it rot out?
No, No, it's not filled with anything, and the wood is pithy, and I could probably, well, actually, it's pretty hard. There is a little hole here. There's probably a hollow that comes out or connects to one of these shoulders, and maybe over the course of time, it'll continue to deteriorate, and maybe it should be filled, or maybe we go ahead and we turn it into a feature, but you've got living branches all around it, and we don't want to compromise those living branches that are all around it.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but Dylan had asked why you are choosing callus mate.
Because callus mate has a very strong hormonal stimulant when we expose the cambial layer for cellular division, okay? And when we're talking about heavy vascular production species, like a maple or something like that, I don't want to cause coarse healing in a maple, right? So I kind of use the top gen and I steer clear of that hormone filled callus mate. But when we start to talk about trees that have a hard time callusing, trees that compartmentalize slowly, trees that have the potential to die back, callus mate is what allows us to really stimulate the production of vascular tissue, and that's where I find it to be the most valuable.
Bentley asked, how long will it take for that lower branch to start to thrive after lifting up the tips?
1 year. 1 year. Next year, we'll see a dramatic transition in the behavior of this tree. I have no doubt about it, okay? And especially as I make them more photosynthetically capable, there's beautiful, Lonnie, can you see that? Or Jesus, can you see that? Yeah, that's one. There's beautiful, fine, let me move that out of the way, fine branching that's coming adventitiously from different locations in the trunk that are a good indication. The tree we talked about, we had to recover the roots, we did recover the roots, and now the roots are recovered. We're gonna get a nice positive production of growth as a result of this cutback at this time with this tree because we did it right from the roots and started building out.
Similar question Eric P. had, or similar subject in ways, why does pointing the branch tip up change the hormonal response of the tree?
Okay, so we talk about conifers grow conically because they're loaded with auxin, right? And that's what suppresses lateral bud growth and allows that elongating shoot to occur. We see the round shape of broadleaf deciduous because they are more cytokinin dominant. But when you have a very short tree and it starts to accumulate a lot of vigor, the stronger areas, this is still a tree that wants to be bigger. So it has to have auxin to create apical leaders that get big enough to start to develop into broader spanning cytokinin-filled stuff, okay? So if you have a vertically growing piece, it's got auxin in the tip, which is suppressing cytokinin, right? And it's becoming stronger and stronger because auxin is what causes elongation, right, of growth. You have branches that are facing down. They're all cytokinin. They're no auxin. They stop elongating. They can't produce that upward growing phototropic effect. They're bifurcating, but they're getting weaker and weaker and weaker as the rest of the tree is growing up and getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And over the course of time, the energy system, tree says, hey, lower branch, you're not doing as much as your upper brethren. I can't continue to afford to spend resources on you if you're not going to pull your weight. And we're saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We'll pull our weight. We'll pull our weight, right? A little bit of auxin gets in here, we get some elongating tips, we get sugar starch productivity, we build vascular growth, we contribute to the sugar bank of the system, and the tree says, oh, okay, no problem, we're good, right? So we're just correcting the system. We're generating more resources through that orientation by allowing auxin to now contribute to the growth and the strength at the tips of those lower branches, okay? I've got a little conundrum here. Jesus, bring me in tight for a moment. Okay, I've got this big long piece. Do I want this big long piece to come back into the interior? It's very tempting because notice that this piece is occurring above this piece. Can you zoom out just for a little bit and show the structure? Okay, this piece is above this piece. So I could technically use this back in the interior here. Okay, now some of us might say, aren't you crossing over this branch because this occurs on the right and this occurs on the left? Yeah, there's some of that. How much can we fudge with that factor? The older a tree, I think the more you can fudge. I don't want to do something that's structurally inappropriate. That's not going to age well. But I think I can put the style of movement into that branch that makes it look natural. If it breaks, we would have cut it off anyways. If the movement looks good, I mean, we're brilliant because we thought of, so this is where we're at right now. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get these two pieces put into a position where they contribute. The upper one I certainly want to take off the most. So I'm going to push it until it potentially breaks and see if we can't put it to use. If I can use it, I don't have to regrow something in its place, and that's a smart use of time and the tree's resources.
Gary asks, how should we think about the length of the primary branches versus the scale of this tree and the girth of this trunk?
How should we think about the length of the primary branches? Well, I think we always want to show a sense of scale in our trees. And the longer that the primary branches get in terms of distance from the trunk, the smaller the trunk looks, right? So this tree has lost its proportion of looking like a grand, big representation of a hornbeam in miniature. It just kind of looks like an overly elongated bonsai tree at this point. Well, I want to take this back to a scale and proportion that starts to actually look like a full-grown hornbeam. And that's where, you know, that is a little bit subjective, but there's also just some fundamental proportions that exist inside of trees that we identify with and can connect with from our references to those trees and our experiences in the native environment, in their natural growth habit, etc. And so I want to magnify the proportions. I want to generate the best sense of scale. And when they get too long and the trunk starts to look really skinny, that's your immediate trigger. Even if you don't know, even if you don't have a reference for what that natural growth habit is, that sense of proportion in bonsai is the most important aspect of design, beyond a shadow of a doubt. We're seeking to reduce internodes. We're seeking to shrink down the leaf size. These are all plays on proportion. Okay, let me secure this here. And then we can go ahead and we can try to bend this thing. All right, so I'm going to roll with the wire, which is always risky to change the orientation, but I've got a natural bend right here. So I'm trying to take advantage of that natural bend. That's what's going to allow this. That's what's going to allow this to potentially have the capacity to contribute. If I'm working against a natural bend with a broadleaf deciduous tree, you can assume that you're going to have failure. Okay, so I've got to work with that natural bend. So I've got another natural bend here. I don't want to put it over the top of this, but that's how I continue to shorten. Now I can work with the natural bend here. I've got this natural arc. Let me go ahead and use my wire as a hook. When I say use it as a hook, I want to have the capacity to apply leverage by hooking it out here to apply the least amount of force and get the greatest amount of bend. Okay, I'm always going to spread. Notice my fulcrum. And I pull that tip to spread those pieces. Now this piece can start to move. Now I can start to accentuate that a little bit more. Okay, I can start to play on that. I can start to move that. Let me get this wire out of the way. Okay. All right, now, you know, when you look at this and you see that branch turn back to the inside, it doesn't look unnatural because I didn't take it back to the inside. I've got these two branches here. I didn't take it back to the inside across it like this, right? I took it back to the inside up like this. So I'm not coming across it and presenting it on the same level or just, you know, this. I came up and around, and I'm fine with that sitting here and this sitting here and having this kind of relationship. Let me show you from the side here. Okay, Jesus, can you focus right there? Right here? Go ahead and pull back just a little bit. Okay, now we see this coming back. Okay, it's moving away from you here and circling back in here. You see this below it. That space and style difference, that's acceptable. That's acceptable. If we can execute it on that level, I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that, right? Now that we've gotten it in that position, let's reduce. I'm going to cut back because this is a very strong branch. I'm going to cut back to my first strong branches on any one of these pieces, okay? And I'm just going to go slow. I'm going to start to reduce. Feels good. I'm going to reduce a little bit more. Yes, I like that. Okay, this one doesn't have as many strong pieces. I'm going to cut back to a strong little twiglet there. I'm going to cut these elongated pieces back to the interior. Got a little bit of a structural flaw here. I'm going to take off that coarser tip. I'm going to continue working. I've got another structural flaw here, downward growing branch with no real interest in the movement. I'm going to take that off. Okay, I've got another structural flaw here. I've got two branches coming out of that initial point. I'm going to take off. The one that's the weakest and less least ramified, okay? And all of a sudden, you know, I've got that tip, and I'm going to take that wire off because I don't need it anymore. I've got that tip beautifully pruned, okay? Watch it. I'm going to do it again here, right? I've got this big elongated piece. I want to direct energy down. I'm going to cut back to my second bud, 1, 2, alternating, and I'm directionally pruning. Boom. That pushes that branch in this direction into that space. I've got this big, strong, healthy tip. I'm going to take that back just to reduce and redirect that energy. I'm going to take off my stubs here. That's a really well-worked area to have changed and transition that energy distribution. Now look at how much that allows this to have that capacity to photosynthesize, right? Now this is in an area, in a region, where we can get this to be strong. Let's go ahead and prune this back because it's sitting over these bottom branches. Take out anything that doesn't have an elongated tip. I'm going to shorten these upper vertically growing pieces to transition energy, taking those back to 2. Always looking to prune back to a strong interior piece here. Pruning back, elongated, you know, non-ramified, less than ideal branching. Okay, but really focusing right here. Notice what's happening right here. Okay, I've got this big long piece. This is at the tip of the branch, right? When you look here, it's all the way at the tip of the branch. I want to take that off. I want to hold that tip back or else it's going to get longer and longer, woodier and woodier, and I'm going to lose more and more strength in the interior. When you get those interior buds, transition to those interior pieces. Strong branch, we want to hold it back. We want better proportion in our design, etc. This is the moment to be making that move, okay? And that really dramatically opens the door for this lower branch. Now take a look. Take a look at how much we push that back. Boom, pushed it back big time. Let's push it back a little bit more. I'm going to take back some of this, take back some of this. Okay, really, really nice and reduced right in here. Let's come back to here. Okay, I've got this big, strong piece. Now I see this, here's a structural flaw. I see this might be movable and I might be able to fan this laterally. Let's go ahead and let's pursue that. This piece to this piece feels like we have some potential there. Keep it rolling, Ira.
Ricky D asks, do you know for sure that Korea is not collecting Korean Hornbeam Yamadori anymore? Is this something that you've been told? Curious where they were collected, and is that from South Korea in general?
South Korea, to the best of my knowledge, and I think that they're probably, you know, because it's not like Korean Hornbeams, they collected every single one and they don't grow anymore, right? But there was a big boom in bonsai demands. There's a prolonged history of occupation in Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, and their sort of relationships as differing cultures and countries that have had differing impacts on each other. And I think that there probably was a significant amount of Korean hornbeams put into bonsai production in the boom period of Japan. So, you know, much like there's also a very special species in Korea that grows in the foothills of Korean red pine that has a dramatically thicker bark than the Japanese red pine. I mean, insanely thick bark and fantastic characteristics. It's been said there aren't hardly any more of those in the mountains as well, because again, you get these boom periods, there's profit to be made, you know, and these trees are collected, they're handled, they're exported. There's also profound quality of bonsai in Korea itself. There's significant quality of really high-level Korean bonsai practitioners that are using these in addition to having been exported to Japan. So there's a whole slew of opportunities and sort of reasons why these were heavily collected. Maybe they're regrowing, maybe somebody's cultivating them, maybe there are some remote locations where there are still some collectible hornbeam, but for the most part, I'm relatively certain, at least from, you know, during my apprenticeship, that there were no more real significant collecting sites of good, old, interesting Korean hornbeam. And again, strictly from South Korea to the best of my knowledge.
Rupen has a question and says, would you do this work now if you planned on repotting the tree this coming spring?
I want to know when I do this work that I have fixed the root system and the strength of the root system, the condition of the root system, okay? I need to know that to confidently do a cutback on an old tree that's been a bonsai for a long time, okay? So if the work on the roots was something that needed to precede this styling to build the energy so that the tree can respond, then I've got to be patient. In that instance, you've got to be patient. And that's where we said, listen, this tree had a strength discrepancy last year, and we had to rebuild the sheen to have the strength for it to respond positively to this. We kind of walked this line as the tree recovered, as we got those big, strong, elongating tips in the upper area of the tree, hoping that we didn't lose. And looking at this, there's very few terminal buds on the end of that branch. Maybe that one is a lost cause. And you say, well, then should you have pruned earlier to save that branch? No, because once a tree goes down this road of deteriorating to a degree where it's going to start losing branches, you have to worry about the health of the entire tree. You can't focus on the health of a branch and take the strength out of the tree to save a singular branch, right? You've got to build the root system, you've got to build the vascular system. Only way you do that is to take your hands off, not overly prune, allow the tree to grow, allow that growth to generate sugars and starches, etc. So from that perspective, Rupin, you've got to decide, are the roots in a condition, are they in a circumstance that allows them to positively respond if we do this work right now? I don't think there's a big challenge with broadleaf deciduous trees being pruned in the fall and being repotted in the spring in the way that we say, listen, we don't do that work with conifers. Deciduous move more water. They can adapt and they can accommodate that kind of work more back-to-back and without recovery if the tree is strong and healthy. But again, the question is always, is the tree strong? Is the tree healthy? Is the tree capable of responding well?
Gary asked if you could talk about how you're choosing the gauge of aluminum wire for the different branches.
I am picking the gauge that allows me to move the branch anywhere I want it to go, Gary, and this is always going to be my response to this question. I think people, and it's a challenging thing to discuss because when I say this, I say, listen, I think people undergauge their wire all the time. I think especially with brittle trees or trees where we're making major restyling moves. A lot of times people say, well, I don't have to move the branch that much, so I'm going to use a lighter gauge. You might as well not wire the tree, okay? Because then you want to move it after you start styling and you try to move it and you fidget with it and you bend it and you say, oh man, Korean Hornbeam doesn't like to be wired because some of the branches died. No, you just didn't use the correct gauge. You wanted to move the branch more than you had the capacity to move it. All of a sudden you're playing with it too much, branch got weak, branch died because you abused it in that process, okay? Or, oh man, I bent it and they're so brittle. No, just used an inappropriate gauge, had to bend it farther than it needed to go. Branch broke as a result of the inappropriate gauge. You should have just used the correct gauge. Use the gauge that allows you to move the branch anywhere you want it to go, and then you don't have to worry about any of that, right? So when you get into the finer branches, you've got to sort of temper that heavy-handedness that we have to show when we're resetting structure, etc. But when we're working on these thicker branches, you've got to be going pretty big to be able to move those pieces in a manner and method that allows you to really start to rebuild. Okay, now we're starting to see that pushback here. And look at what this does. These pieces that we kind of moved up into this area are starting to really have and find their place. Now we can start to spread these out and we're rebuilding that structure. We're coming here now and it's starting to happen. And this, we want to push this back. We don't have the resources to do so. I am going to wire it though. I said I was going to wire this whole thing out. I'm going to wire this and start to distribute these branches. You'll be surprised at how much we can close the gap on the upper stronger areas and the lower weaker areas by the time we're finished.
Isaiah asks, what kind of ceramic would you repot this tree in if you had the choice?
Yes, that's a good question. I am such a huge fan, and this may come from my bias as a coniferous grower, and obviously with some of our more wild Western native trees, our wilder European and North American species, aesthetics, Yamadori. I absolutely challenge the notion that a conifer should not be put into a glazed pot. I'm open to exploring that aesthetic. I love exploring that aesthetic, especially with Mr. Horst Heinzelreiter, who, you know, through his glazes establishes significant insinuations of aggregate, rock, deterioration, age, crust. You know, it's like, however you interpret it. Is it volcanic? Is it eroding? Is it craggly bark-looking texture that complements the ruggedness? Yes, it's all of those things. Horst, his pots have single-handedly and solely challenged the aesthetic and the assumption of the traditional ceramic sort of job in the bonsai process, okay? So from that perspective, I love challenging that coniferous model can't sit inside of a glazed container. When it comes to broadleaf trees, it's undeniable that the new growth each year, the winter silhouette, the fall color, the summer sort of photosynthetic period, each of these are opportunities to access different points of design and create different dialogues. To not tap into that through the use of color as a primary methodology of exploring aesthetics and design is a lost opportunity in my mind, okay? So instead of the convention of, oh man, I can't put a conifer in a glazed container, I have to put a deciduous in a glazed container. And I'm not saying I have to put a deciduous in a glazed container. I'm fully willing to challenge that aesthetic and challenge that convention. But I think it's a lost opportunity to not engage that aspect of design where we get to really explore the impact of color. And that's where I think a glazed container for this would be beautiful. Now when we say, okay, a glazed container, what color are we talking about? Now we start to get into the notions of what portion of the tree are we accentuating through its color combination. Oh, okay, color is a great thing in design. I'm going to put it in a glazed container that has color. Well, now you've got to start to decide, are we tapping into the orange, red, yellow of the fall color? I mean, you know, take a look at this. This is an incredible foliar display. Yeah, I mean, that's rock and roll right there. That's beautiful, okay? Are we tapping into the green over the course of the year? Are we tapping into the sort of milky white off gray of the trunk in the winter silhouette? Each of these is going to have a different color combination that allows you to maximize that design opportunity. And just to satisfy your curiosity, what would I put this in? I think that Korean Hornbeam does really well. I think this is a moderately masculine, feminine sort of tree. It's in the middle. I would go with a moderately saturated blue as the best possible complement to the red fall color. And I think you would see this tree just absolutely boom with quality. I think blue would be absolutely to die for. Middle of the growing season, tough to deny the power and the value of cream in terms of that aesthetic that it creates with the hornbeam green.
Matt asks, can you use sacrificed branches to help correct weaker lower branches, letting a tip grow up to reinvigorate a particular region?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why we're not heavily pruning those lower pieces, right? We're sort of leaving them a lot less handled and manipulated to be able to empower those pieces. Now you're seeing, notice how I'm redistributing branching here, and I'm using some of these pieces, I'm elevating some of these pieces, I'm creating these independent billowy masses. Let me show you that. Okay, I'm creating a mass here, I'm creating a mass here, I'm going to create a mass here. That's how I'm starting to raise these pieces with a strategy that contributes to the aesthetic. I don't want to just raise something up in the air. I want to raise something up in the air with a strategy that improves the aesthetic of that piece. Okay, and we're kind of backing into this area over here, but making major reductions in this area that's going to inform and influence the length that we can pursue over there. Stay with me, because we're going to watch. You're going to watch this radically transform at this point. Okay. Now this is that weak piece that we didn't know if it had buds. I see some weak buds at the base of some of the branches. If I'm going to be getting this strong, I have to get these tips up. I can't leave this saying, oh my gosh, it's weak, I can't wire it. If it's weak, right, then the only way, if we're wiring the rest of the tree, the only way to build strength in this is to reorient these buds, okay? Now, if your wiring skill is rough, if your hands, if you're crashing through these branches, you're breaking things, and these branches are weak, your wire is super tight, and it starts to constrict them, yeah, you don't want to be wiring a tree that's weak if your wiring skills are not up to par to being able to handle delicacy. But if your wiring skills are good, wires should always empower the tree to be more photosynthetically efficient. to be more sustainably designed. And that's where wiring these pieces is really important, because I've wired everything else up. If this is the weakest piece on the tree and I leave these hanging down, or I leave these in a less than ideal circumstance, there's no way the tree is going to keep these. And I need for this tree to keep these. If it doesn't, we'll accommodate, we'll adapt. But if I can keep these, best case scenario, right? I don't have to rebuild something. I don't have to reconceptualize.
Isaiah has a question. It says, does Korean Hornbeam take in more water since it's a broadleaf deciduous tree, and how does it compare to other deciduous trees?
It takes in more water than if we compare it to a broadleaf evergreen, or if we compare it to an evergreen conifer, right? As far as other broadleaf deciduous, because that deciduous model, thinner cuticle, larger leaf surface area, greater amount of transpiration, greater amount of photosynthesis, which photosynthesis requires water, right? And greater amount of necessity to cool with that increased leaf mass, thinner cuticle, and higher photosynthetic capacity, okay? That's a really nice little execution of that area down there. I'm happy with that. I'm really happy with this. Okay, so when we think about that, I would say Korean Hornbeam is a moderate water mover inside of the broadleaf deciduous model. I would say it's moderate at best. So we say it does have the ability, right, in Korean Hornbeam. Why does it not produce callus so readily? Yeah, it moves water, but it doesn't move water rapidly, right? It photosynthesizes, but it doesn't produce an abundant amount of sugars and starches. It is a species of tree that just works a little bit more slowly than our more aggressive water utilizers, like our maples, our more aggressive callus forming trees, like our stewardias, like our beeches, etc. Okay? All right. So now that we have that reference, let's kind of come back to the upper portion of this right side here and start to explore how we handle this. Now, we moved some pieces backing up into that area. We've got this big hole in our apical region. Let's start to redistribute these pieces and prune them to now fit into this transition that we've already started to build. I've got to work with natural angles and natural movement, natural bends, so that I don't compromise the integrity of the branches. So I'm going to continue to be very intelligent about where I exercise that force when I apply it to the bending of the pieces. But let's go ahead and see if we can work this apex up. If we elevate and adjust this apex, it's going to inform the length on that right side.
Grace asks, at this age, would you ever want or need to regrow a branch from all the way back in on the trunk?
Almost impossible. Almost impossible at this age. I'm not saying it's impossible, Grace, but it probably at this growth rate, having been a bonsai for a long time, is gonna take longer than you and I have. Now, that's not necessarily the decision-making process that we apply in bonsai. The next generation can carry that project on. There's always, it's always about the very best tree in terms of the decisions that we make. But I would say when you see people cutting back really old broadleaf deciduous trees back to stumps, they have a mature structure, they cut back to the trunk. There's some discussion of it's not an ideal structure, so we've got to cut it all off and start over again. That is I think, one of the most toxic concepts in the broadleaf deciduous world, right? That's one of the most toxic concepts, because these trees that have been bonsai, that have been old, anybody can come in here and say, oh yeah, just cut it all back to the trunk and regrow it. Guess that's the only way. When have you ever seen a tree cut back to the trunk and regrown from scratch become a great bonsai? And I'll wait for your answer, because, once every, 20, 30 years, you might see that. And I'm not talking about a young tree where we're making initial decisions, we're setting structure, and that's what setting the structure needed to correct structural flaws, to potentially maximize a really quality trunk that had some issues. Okay, I get that. But when have you seen a big, mature, beautiful tree that's been a bonsai for a long time cut back to the trunk and actually become a quality tree over the course of time? And the answer is never, never. Not the way these trees should be handled. You'll never really get there in terms of recovering it. You'll have a big scar, tree's not vigorous enough to respond. All of the things of putting it in a bonsai container are working against you. You got to kind of figure it out. You've got to really figure it out. How do we use the strength of the tree? How do we redirect the strength of the tree? How do we utilize the branches? How do we grow that thing first instead of cutting back and trying to regrow it on a tree that's already had its strength reduced through the cultivation of bonsai? Okay, because this whole goal, just bear in mind, why do we put it in a shallow container? Number one, because it looks awesome. Number two, so we can manage and reduce the amount of energy in the tree to get smaller proportions. We said in the very beginning, hey, listen, it's all about scale. It's all about scale. The perspective of a larger tree in miniature. That's why we put the tree in the bonsai pot. Shrinks down the scale of the inner nodes, shorter inner nodes, scale of the leaves, smaller leaves, right? Slows down the growth habit. You put this tree in the field, you tried to prune it, the number of times that you'd have to prune it to get fine branching, you could never slow down the growth or create the proportions that would look like a larger tree in miniature. Because you don't have the control, you don't have that reduction, you don't have the scalability of the roots. All of those are products of the bonsai container.
David has a question. It says, don't older looking trees have shorter, less foliage-bearing branches with more negative space?
Totally. And where do we want to go with this tree over the course of time? That sounds nice. I like what you just said to me. I even like the way that you said it to me, right? It was beautifully put. Yes, older trees have, shorter branches, more space, tighter, more compact. Great. This tree is not at a stage of health where we can pursue that kind of design. So what are we doing? We're starting the process. We're rebuilding the strength. We're resetting things. We're redistributing. We're taking out structural flaw. We're doing all the work that's going to allow us to get there over, say, the next 5, 6, 8 years of work on this tree. Okay, and all I'm doing here is, remember, I had to cut out that apical piece. Now look at where this was. It was here. Now look at where it is. It's here. I'm going to continue working on this. I'm going to continue to reduce some of this. Now I want to grow these pieces into this space, but I want to do so slowly. This is a mature tree. I don't want a big, long, straight branch in here now. These pieces can fan out. 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 We took out that big butt cut, right? Took out that apex. Now we have all these branches that are here, and we start to occupy that space here, right? And we even occupy it here, okay? That's how we redistribute branching to really regain that proportion.
Kim has a question and says she has a small hornbeam in a shallow pot. It has a flush, and then the leaves get black and crispy on the edges, but are alive in the middle. Is this overwatering, or is it drying and not moving enough water to the leaves on windy or warm days?
Yeah, black and crispy on the edges might be underwatering, could be overwatering causing a pathogen and a decline in the root system. That's preventing the roots from being able to hydrate the tree. A lot of times we see Pseudomonas, specifically in our deciduous. If they're overwatered, we see Pseudomonas start to act on the foliar mass, but that's actually an indicator of roots. Either way, if your tree is growing and then the leaves are crinkling up, it's a root-related issue of sorts, especially if it's broadly spread across the entire tree. Okay, I got a radical proposition for you. I had not seen this before, but I have a bar branch right here that, again, I did not see it. I have another branch back in here. There's a nice little internode between these two pieces in that cross-pollination of structure, but this thing here, this is a little bit of a problem child right here. Go ahead and bring me to the wide spot, Josh. Okay, this is a little bit of a problem child. Now, if I take that out, there's not a lot of interior branching below it. If I leave it, I'm going to have to lose this branch over here. If I leave this, I have to take this branch plus the back branch. I don't think I can afford to do that. I think the move, and this comes back to a big removal, I'm not cutting it back to regenerate the branch like Grace asked. I'm cutting this thing back. I have a really beautiful collar here formed. I'm even going to be conservative there. Okay, I'm cutting this thing back so that I regain the proportion of the tree. Look at that. That was the move. That was the move that we've kind of been waiting for. Now let me put that back on the tree for you, just so that you understand where that came from. Okay, I'm talking here, right? Looks good, looks good. Yes, I see that now. Look at the space. Look at the space that's created. Okay, now again, these lower branches, I need to give these all the benefit of the doubt that I possibly can. Okay? So that move just empowered these pieces to be able to occupy this space in a very healthy and successful way, right? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to now reduce some of this area as well back to strong interior pieces. Boom. Let me see what I have here. I'm going to have to keep this. This doesn't have the strength. It's been suppressed underneath that. I do have a nice strong little butt at the base here. Because of that, I've got that strong butt at the base. I'm going to take this back fairly significantly. And you're saying, wow, that's taking it back a lot. Are you sure that's going to be okay? It's going to be fine. Why? Because now it has sun exposure, right? I've got good strong buds that I cut back to. This is not the weak branch on the bottom. This is a strong branch that has elongating pieces. I have to be very, very sure, confident, and aggressive in those areas if I'm going to take the stronger pieces and I'm going to capitalize on this strength redistribution that I've built the root system to be able to respond positively to, right? I have to be confident. I have to believe in the strength of the tree. I built it. The buds show it. Means we got to use it.
Cheebird Steve is following up on a response that you had earlier to a question. Said, following up on your comment, what do you see as the quote-unquote job of the ceramic in the usual bonsai model, and how has Heinzelreiter changed that?
Oh, the job of the ceramic in the usual bonsai model is a good question. Job of the ceramic was to hold the tree, okay? The function of the container was not to usurp the tree, and in fact, it was completely subservient to the tree. And again, if you have not listened to our podcast from when we went to the trophy in Europe, and Troy and Lime interviewed several European ceramicists, Tom Benda, Jan Kulik, Thor Holvilla, and it's the Thor Holvilla piece that I would most want to draw your attention to, because Thor spent significant time studying ceramics in Tokoname, Japan. And, you know, Thor is a Swedish ceramicist through and through. He went and he studied the tradition of ceramics to try and understand it, to try and be exposed to you know, techniques he might not have seen, to a production level. And he breaks it down for you in that podcast and explains, hey, the Japanese model of ceramics came from sort of a retrofitting of a ceramic community and skill set with ceramics that ultimately had sort of lost its way, or lost its necessity in the culture of the time, right? And so from that perspective, they sort of about-faced, and they started creating bonsai ceramics with the same production quality, et cetera, that they were originally building household and usable lifestyle things with. Okay, so when you think about that, it was never designed. These weren't people that were like, I'm creating ceramic art. I'm building new aesthetics. I'm breaking new ground. I'm exploring the context of the tree. They were like, oh, bonsai trees need this shape of pot, you know, that came from China, and here's some colors that are commonly, yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll make those for those people that are making bonsai trees, and this is what they want, and that's what we'll do. And that model stayed the same because there wasn't a notion of changing it, challenging it, exploring it, right? Now, I think in the more modern form of ceramics, or at least the Western form of ceramics, you see the ceramic being a point equal to the tree in exploration and artistic merit, craftsmanship, and aesthetic nuance, right? And then I think you also see refreshing returns to tradition, or duplication of tradition in the Western model, where it's like, hey, amazing level of craftsmanship and proportion and color that matches the traditional model, and yet it's a Western pot. You have room for both. Depends on the tree. Do I feel the need to break new ground with this Korean hornbeam? No, it's a traditional tree imported from Japan, created under a culture that abided by that aesthetic of that ceramic relationship with the tree. My guess is this would look really awkward if we suddenly tried to make this tree some radical naturalistic, or not naturalistic, some radical exploration of Western aesthetic, when we're dealing with a tree that originated in the East and carries with it that connotation, history, aesthetic, provenance, etc. How are we doing on time, Ira?
7:55.
Okay. We're going to get real close. Stay with me for the cutback, because we're finally earning our keep here.
No comments from the peanut gallery, please. Isaiah, however, has a question next and says, how many different apices could you make on a deciduous tree?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because you don't have an apical dominance necessarily that creates the multiple apice form that we see in the coniferous model. You see a suppression of the auxin and a natural gravitation towards cytokinin-driven growth when a broadleaf deciduous either maxes out its resource availability in the immediate environment, so it has no more water to raise against the force of gravity, or it's grown tall enough that it no longer has the vascular structure to support more vertical growth. Once that happens, auxin can't rise any further to establish that irregular distribution of auxin, and all of a sudden you see cytokinin being an equal contributor that starts to create the more naturally domed aesthetic and that broadening effect of that up, out, more oak or billowy mass style, okay? So that's a physiological response. Multiple apices inside of a broadleaf deciduous can occur, but those are just the informal billowy masses that are occurring at all of the different levels of the tree that still, I would say, don't necessarily quantify. It's an apex, it's a branch, it's an apex, it's a branch, it's an apex, it's a branch. There's never really any clarity or definition or necessity of definition for that matter, you know, in terms of the broadleaf deciduous model.
Miss Mel is wondering if this is planted in 100% Akadama.
100% Akadama, Miss Mel.
Joshua had a similar question and said he has 2 hornbeams that never seem to do great, even in 100% Akadama. He's in Denver.
Well, you know, here's what I would say. Any hornbeam that doesn't do well is probably a sheen-related issue, right? If you haven't fixed the sheen, if the sheen's not in good shape, good condition, it's tough to get a hornbeam to do well. Okay, take a look at what we've got here. Yes, yes, now we're starting to find those branch lines. We're starting to find those moments. We still have those tips coming up. I don't want to bring it down too much. If I bring it down too much, I'm going to further weaken it. I've got a little bit too long of a branch here. You know, I want to cut these back. I want to adjust that. I can't. They're a little bit weak. I don't want to overly bend them. That's what we get out of that aesthetic. But you notice we've pushed back. We opened up that space. Now we've created this. Let's work to the back here and let's see if we can get through just a redistribution of some of this stuff that allows us to really get that rapid reduction.
And last question for the moment anyway is David wonders, isn't broom style multiple apices?
Broom style is not multiple apices. Broom style is historically one single homogenized apice, which is what forms the broom. Yeah, no, I don't see broom style as a multiple apice form in any way or any sort of definition of the word.
And then Matt came in with a question just now and said, if you would have wanted to pursue the traditional form, how would you have handled all of the weaker lower branches and the discrepancy in the strength distribution?
So just bear in mind, I'm not necessarily not producing the traditional form. You know, the traditional form of broadleaf deciduous trees in Japan typically is an up and out sort of aesthetic. When we start to talk about the coniferous form or the orthodox form of handling the broadleaf deciduous, I would say this is not the most necessarily the most commonly practiced form in Japan, although it is practiced on their broadleaf deciduous. I don't necessarily think that you could say that's the most common form. So this is the way that I'm handling this is a traditional management and handling of the broadleaf deciduous model. It's just moving out of that notion of trying to make this look like an orthodox pine with those downward lowest branches that have the tips facing down and have a flat pad, and we're bringing it up into that broadleaf deciduous model that empowers this tree to have success. So it's a shift more away from the orthodox. And if I've misquantified that over the work, I apologize. I see where that could get confusing, but hopefully that clarifies that.
Shoheen Stig says, can you go over the process of addressing sheen issues of a hornbeam? It's been a while.
So here's the deal with sheen issues on a hornbeam. Okay, now I'm going to reduce some of these coarse pieces because I've got a nice strong back branch that had no competition. If I, you know, and I don't want to cut this back super heavily because I'm not trying to reduce it and I don't really have a lot of branching here, okay? So just giving you a clue of where I'm at. the key with hornbeam is to not let sheen issues begin. That's the key, okay? First and foremost, don't let it start so that you don't have to address it, okay? Be working in the sheen. Black areas, bad biology, decomposing soil in the sheen. We're constantly sort of looking, checking, doing a thorough enough repot when we dig into these broadleaf deciduous high water mobility species that we are aware. Now, you don't want to bare root a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous, much like you don't want to bare root a conifer, okay? They are a slightly lower water mobility. They depend on the health and the biology of the sheen to have that strength as a slightly slower growing, more durable broadleaf deciduous species. We don't want to be cleaning it out like we do a maple. That's why we call them sheen-based and maple non-sheen-based, right? But if you get in there and you start to see funkiness, you start to see compaction, if you aren't going deep enough in your repots to be exploring and continually opening that up, making sure you're cleaning off the surface so that you have good water percolation, getting all the way to the sheen, etc. Those fundamental care and maintenance things that happen over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, then eventually we do get to a point where we start losing branches, we lose vigor, and all of a sudden we've got a sheen that we have to take a more immediate and, I would say, dramatic action on. In that instance, we're going to go into the sheen. We're going to take away that blackened soil. We're going to try to find some nice living root. We're going to create a hole to access and fill with good akadama from the surface. All of that is very, very aggressive, especially for a tree that has been having its growth rate reduced in a bonsai container. And we can expect that there's going to be potentially some dieback as a result of that. Right? So the key is don't let it get there. If it gets there, you've got to go. There's not much that you can do. You've got to take action and you've got to do the appropriate thing to rectify that issue. It sucks. I just tell you right now, you do not want to get to that point where that's what you're doing on your Korean hornbeams, because it means that a lot of the things that you like about your hornbeam aren't going to be there when the tree recovers from that operation. Okay, so we have this opportunity back here in the back. See how long that is? If I pull that in, right, number one, I get light to this piece here, but if I pull this in, I also start to create an in-out vibe. And there was a question that said, hey, don't you want more negative space? Isn't that going to make it look older? Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. We haven't had the strength to be able to do that. We have an opportunity back in here in terms of working with this piece. So I'm just kind of looking at these bigger, longer pieces, coarse, elongated. I've got good buds. I'm going to start to shorten some of that so that I can just work with some of these finer branches and start to redistribute in this fashion where it's a little bit more controlled, a little bit lighter touch, right? Just having just a little bit more nuance to what we're trying to accomplish through the work. If I can reduce it instead of wiring it and trying to fit all that length in, and I've got the buds and the strength to cut back to, that's always going to be preferable as we start to adjust length, rebuild, and push that energy top to bottom, exterior to interior, okay? But you got to have the buds, you got to have the strength, and you got to have the root system set up to be able to benefit from that decision.
We are all caught up on questions.
Okay. I know it's getting late. How we doing? Still in the fight?
804 on your FM dial.
Uh-huh. This is a big question here, too. I think I'm going to cut that back as well. 804 on the FM dial.
Big change, though, so far, huh?
Oh, man. This is the kind of broadleaf deciduous work that I don't necessarily see, renovation of traditional trees. You don't necessarily have to plant it in a box and like rebuild from scratch. That's not always the move. And in fact, I would say that's starting to become like a almost rinse and repeat response. And anytime we get into rinse and repeat responses, we have to recognize that that's dangerous, right? Because we start broadly applying. That's like saying, oh, now you got to cut it back to the trunk and regrow everything. Oh, you got to put it in a box and let it get strong again. It's like, or just take a softer, right? It's not if one drop is good, 10 drops is better, right? It's like take a softer, more nuanced approach. Like, bonsai is such a nuanced art form. It's not a one size fits all. It's not It's not a this is the trend and this is the action. This tree has these circumstances. How do we work within these circumstances to maximize the best possible capacity to recover? The shape, the health, the design, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's where this move on this tree, having been in a bonsai pot, if I take this out of this bonsai pot and I put this tree into a grow box and I radically up its vigor, I'm going to lose a lot of the attractive aspects of age. I'm going to get a bunch of straight, vigorous branches growing out of the trunk that have very little reflection of age, completely empowered, youthful, and then I'm going to what? Cut back to all of those and rebuild the aged aesthetic of 20 to 30 years? No, just take a breath, relax a little bit, make a balanced decision as to the best possible methodology to go about addressing the tree. We rebuilt the strength, now we can start the cutback, we can do so slowly. This tree will be absolutely on fire next year, guarantee it.
I remember you had talked before about trying to do work on trees and maybe like trying to explain what you might do to it and like almost proposing a scope of work if someone wanted to rebuild an old tree.
Oh yeah, I thought that there is a gap in the institutional handling of collections, where there are these older and older trees that are experiencing these sort of downturns in health and loss of aesthetic. And I think one of the most effective things that collections could do is they could put this kind of redesign of older trees out to bid, for the scope of work with bonsai professionals, because not every professional is going to handle the situation the same, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that creates a diversity of experience, it creates a diversity of aesthetics, it creates a diversity of approaches that create a lot of value inside of the bonsai community and inside of the bonsai art form, inside of the aesthetic that we all get to take in and digest, right? I find that to be the magic of bonsai, and I think that it behooves the collection, it behooves the renovation of older trees to not just hand it to the next professional that's traveling through, but to really get a professional's perspective of what the best way to handle that tree is, and to let the professional who appeals to the approach or the process or the natural sort of system of design, aesthetic, spirit of the tree, whatever the connection point is. I find that to be very inspiring. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think it's necessary when you're dealing with historical work. Most people in the Western world of bonsai think, okay, I'm going to get this tree, somebody owned it before, or so-and-so owned it before, I'm going to get it, I'm going to redesign it. I'm going to cut it back, I'm going to redesign it, I'm going to do this, I'm going to restyle it, I'm going to wire the whole thing, whatever the thought process is, the thought process of doing something to change the tree, okay? Yeah, sometimes that's great. Sometimes that's great. But sometimes the history is what makes the tree wonderful. Sometimes the aesthetic that was created is what actually makes the value. You strip a tree of all of that age, sometimes you ruin everything about that tree. I've seen it happen time and again, both in Japan, as well as I think throughout travels in the Western bonsai world.
Crushing it out, one branch at a time right here.
We're getting close.
We're real close.
We're getting close. Maybe took a little bit more wire than I was planning, but not much.
A lot of branches on that tree.
There certainly didn't look like a lot of branches when they were all bundled together. Now as we're starting to spread them out, there's starting to be a lot of branches. And that's what happens when you effectively prune and redesign a tree, is you start to find those little gems. Got a little bit of this is that branch that I inappropriately pruned, which I'm now suffering for my sins, paying the price.
Good example of kind of creating space and filling space, I think, tonight too, with some of the removals that you did earlier.
Creating space and also distribution, foliar distribution. Okay, because now with all that space, I'm redistributing a lot of that growth. If I balance the branching quantity in those areas, then it starts to look as though I have a homogenized sort of density. Notice the bottom branches don't look as sparse as they originally did. They don't look as sparse as they originally did, okay? And this is the process by which we reinvigorate those bottom branches, bring those tips up. We make them photosynthetically sustainable, design-wise, right? We continue to reconstruct this thing until we have it finished. Now the apex is probably gonna take me, I'm guessing another 20 to 30 minutes. I know everybody's got bedtime. I got a team of people that I gotta let go. They're super generous with their time. We do owe the Mirai team a lot of appreciation for the fact that they're willing to stay here when we get into these big complex scopes of work. But I'm gonna shut it down for the evening. We're gonna finish this apical region, and I would love to show you the finished product when it's all done. Keep an eye out on our social channels. I'm sure the finished piece will probably be at the tail end of the video when it goes into the library so that you can see it and enjoy that final process. But a really beautiful discussion tonight of how to take, Korean hornbeam, a lot of nuances of hornbeam, but also how to take a broadleaf deciduous tree that is struggling and headed in the wrong direction, and to revamp that, rebuild the strength, handle the pruning process, orient those lower, weaker branches into a position where they start to obtain and gain strength. Josh has got a before picture here to show you guys. And you see that big dense ball, you see the angle of the lower branches, okay, and then bring us into studio again. We start to see that redistribution. Notice the reduction of the proportion, regaining of scale, trunk looks. Go back to that again, Josh. Okay, notice how big this is. Oh, wonderful lineup. Look at you. You are a talented person. Okay, bring us back into studio again. Watch the shrink of the size of the canopy. Okay, it's only gonna get better as we reduce the apex and further distribute. Lots of tools in your toolkit. Let me go one time around. Lots of tools in your toolkit to rebuild, continue your process of evolving your skills and developing. What a special tree though, huh? Really, really beautiful tree. Fantastic piece to be focused on and really putting the effort into. And we'll look forward to this gaining a lot of strength and showing us that health and that distribution all the way through the lowest branches. You got anything else?
We're all good.
That's it. All right, thank you guys. Love you so much. Appreciate the Mirai students being in the studio and the Mirai team. You guys are awesome. All right, we'll see you next time.